Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight marks our return to the middle of nowhere. So get your hiking boots ready, because we're going to explore. Get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. This happened a little over a year ago, on a Sunday early in the morning. I live in the suburbs, but my parents own a farm that I enjoy going to because I get to see my dog, Molly. She's a mutt, but she's not a tiny dog by any means. At that time, I felt very safe around her and would often take her for walks in a forest that was nearby. The day started off like any other. Me and my dad got in the car, drove around for a while, and arrived at the farm. I immediately got out of the car and hugged Molly. My parents always got angry when I hugged her, since I'd smell like her for the rest of the day. I put my leash on her and asked my dad if I could take her for a walk. He always thought that we would go down a road and back, but I always kind of found it more interesting to take her to the forest. I always felt a certain kind of peace and relaxation there that was unmatched by anything else. So we took a turn and headed to the forest. Usually when there, I would take her leash off so she could explore on her own. Most of the time I'd carve my name into the trees or look for anything interesting. I was playing baseball with some rocks and a wooden leg, presumably from an old table. That's when I heard it. Molly was barking at something. This wasn't the usual bark when we're in the forest. I thought it was a fox or some other animal, so I quickly grabbed the wooden leg like a weapon. I knew that if it was a fox, it wouldn't attack, but I had a sense of security while I was holding it. I called out, "Molly?" She continued barking. This was very strange, since she always comes when I call her. I followed the sound of her barks and stumbled across a scene I will never forget. There was a man, probably in his late 50s, half naked, carrying a large machete in one hand and holding moonshine in the other. This was the first time that I stumbled across someone in the woods, let alone half naked carrying a big-ass machete. He was ignoring Molly completely and hacking away at the ground for some reason. I didn't really know how to handle the situation. Even now, I have no idea how I would handle it. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked in confusion. I don't think I understood the seriousness of the situation at the time. He turned around, revealing his face. He had some of the clearest blue eyes I have ever seen to this day. I could see them so well because they were so wide. "Come here, boy. Look what I've dug up." I was afraid that I didn't listen to him, he would start to chase me, and that was something I wanted to avoid at all costs. I got closer but kept a good distance. I didn't see anything except for an empty hole. He returned to hitting the ground with his machete, occasionally taking sips from the bottle. I used this window of time to get my dog and started walking away slowly, as to not notify him that I was leaving. But then I took one final glance at the man. His head was dug deep in the hole. I was intrigued, so I kept looking. I know it was foolish of me. He got up from the ground, and I was shocked when I saw him carrying a bone in his mouth. I have no idea which animal it belonged to, if it even did belong to an animal. I had seen enough and began sprinting away with my dog. As we ran, I heard him laughing, and that's when I saw something flying from the corner of my eye. It was the machete. I heard him yell, "Damn it!" This made me run even faster. I knew the forest very well, so I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I ripped through branches and bushes until I got out of there, and didn't stop sprinting until I arrived at the garage, where my father was testing out lights on our tractor. I didn't tell him a single thing about the man, since I was afraid that he would get angry and would never allow me to walk Molly anymore. Needless to say, I never went to that forest alone again. Man with the machete and bone in his mouth, I have no intention of coming across you again. I used to live out in the middle of nowhere. The town had less than 200 people in it. I used to work through the night in one of the metro areas, and it was about a 40-minute drive with about 15 of it on a country road. I used to think I would see stuff in the fields, like coyote, deer all the time. Never thought twice. Well, one morning I was on my way home at roughly 3 a.m, and we had a little bridge to cross right before we got to our road. As I'm closing in on crossing the bridge, I can see something pearly white hanging out in the middle of the road. I thought it was probably a swan and it would move. As I got closer, I realized that swans are not that big. I was in an F-150, and it was at eye level with me. When its wings opened up, it literally covered both lanes of traffic. I swerved to miss it but hit something of the wing. I slammed on my brakes and turned around. Whatever it was 100% gone without a trace, and I never saw it again. If it was a bird, it's the biggest bird I've ever seen. Oh, and I also need to let you know that I didn't live by any large body of water. My name is Jack. This story took place outside Minot, North Dakota when I was 17. My church group was having a backyard bash. Basically, all the ones who play music in the surrounding congregation in North Dakota get together in one of the members' backyards and play music, cook awesome food, and hang out with some truly great people. This took place the night before. All the guys my age were hanging out late at Jared's house. If any of you are familiar with Minot, this took place across the Bison Trail before Velna. Anyway, that night all the guys were watching Hot Rod inside at about 11 p.m. Evan, Jared, Tyler, my younger brother, and myself decided to go outside and talk and hang out by Evan's girly truck he was way too proud of. His house was on a hill. The driveway went about 100 feet where Evan's truck was parked. The front yard slowly declined to the road and field, flattened out for about 300 feet, then inclined up a sizable hill. It was pitch black at the time. We were all around Evan's truck, just chatting and having fun. 20 minutes into our conversation, Evan interrupts us and asks if we heard that. We all stopped and said no. I asked what he heard, and he said it sounded like a deep, grunting grasp noise. We all listened for anything and heard nothing but bugs, so we brushed it off, but Evans seemed uneasy. Another 10 minutes into our chat, and we all stopped talking naturally as we paused to think about what to talk about. And just then we heard it again, all of us in unison. The noise was this deep grunt exhale noise that had all of us stop and look towards the direction it came from. We didn't see anything. Evan had his keys and decided to turn on his headlights as it was parked in the right direction. We saw a pair of eyes, shining in the light, just on the outside reach of his headlights, about 400 feet away. I ran inside to grab a maglite, the most recognizable flashlight ever created, and I ran to the edge of the road and Jared came along. I twisted the end to focus the light in a straight beam and found it. A white-tailed buck, a big one, climbing up the hill from bottom right to top left. I found the animal with the beam focused on it, and we were about 250 feet away. The deer stopped and stared at us. I started talking to it, just saying the usual things. "Hey buddy, what you doing out here?" And after about 2 minutes of us talking to him, and him just staring at us, it started to resume its course. But then we heard that same noise again. A grunt, a deep exhale. Jared and I looked at each other puzzled, and I put the light on him again while he was walking up the hill. But something was wrong. It was limping badly. We knew something was wrong, and that's when it happened. We heard a roar 50 feet from our right, the scariest sound I've ever heard, but I've heard it before, in movies and games. Mountain lion. It was the first time hearing it in person. but I knew it was angry, basically saying get the hell away from my meal or I'll have you for dessert. When it roared, Jared and I looked at each other and booked it back to the house. Tyler and Evan were still by the truck while we were down there, but they reacted the same way we did because when we passed the truck in our retreat, they were holding the house door open for us. We told a few of the guys that we were still up and nobody bought it, but we knew what we saw and heard. Mountain lions 3 miles outside of town in North Dakota? Yeah, okay, I know they're rare, but they're there. We were pretty shaken about it, but the next morning my brother and I went to go look for tracks, blood trails or carcasses. We got to the point where we found the deer. We were walking up to where I put my arm out in front of my brother to stop us both, and I heard a rattling. I then saw a rattlesnake pop up 10 feet away and decided the universe was giving us stop signs, so we went back. I lost contact with Jared over time. Evan turned out to be a pretty messed up person that I didn't want to be around anymore, but my brother and I are still close, and we talk about that night to this day. Mountain lions are my favorite animal, and from this encounter I have the utmost respect for them, but after this night, I never went out hiking, biking or walking in that area without protection, for a fight I would lose, because I have a feeling I would not get a second warning. This happened about 3 years ago, when some friends and I went hiking on the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina, close to Boone but still a good 30 minutes drive from the start of the trail. We get in a few hours before we start to make camp, so we could beat the time and enjoy the mountain scenery at dusk before it gets dark. We set up, tie our food and things in the tree, roll a joint, crack open a few, and enjoy the mountain face overlooking the valley. Truly, the Appalachians are drop-dead gorgeous. Then we hear it. There's just this blood-curdling scream out of nowhere, and it seemed to come from our east, opposite from our campground and the trail. We're all immediately freaked out, with a couple of us yelling out, and 1 or 2 pulling out their pistols. We all just stand frozen for a moment. Then we hear it again, and then silence. Like that horror movie silence when everything, the trees, the birds, and the wind, just stop. You could hear everyone breathing, like it was in your ear. None of us had cell service, and it was too dark to make our way to anything like civilization. So the 4 of us just holed up together without sleeping until daybreak. Still a bit freaked, we made our way back to our cars in the parking lot. Now the trails kind of buckle and intersect at time in this area. So we get back, and we'd come close to where we heard the origin of the scream. And lo and behold, we found cougar tracks. We hurried back and contacted the local ranger station to let them know. And the ranger sighed and said, "Yeah, you're not the first to tell us this. So bottom line, those big cats aren't gone." I live just where farmland meets the outer edge of suburbia, on an island off the coast of British Columbia. The climate here is sub-temperate rainforest, so the natural and untouched landscape is incredibly wild, dense, and lush. I'm a keen endurance cyclist, and I take full advantage of the trail network in the forest surrounding my area. I work long hours, so most of my winter rides are in complete darkness with my trusty trail light. One section of my home trail winds through a rainforest bog full of trees, hundreds of feet tall. It's absolutely beautiful in the daytime. It feels like a magical place with shafts of sunlight piercing through the fog. Hundreds of different species of flora and fauna, and so many wild animals coming and going along game trails. At night, my gut starts to tighten as the thought of passing through this mile-long section of trail. One day, about a year ago, I was lucky enough to get a chance for a day ride, so I took it. It was a cold and very rainy winter day, with very few people out on the trail. I had packed thermos of hot coffee in my backpack, and I thought the forest bog was as good a place as any to have a break, to stretch my legs and drink my coffee. I have an interest in botany, so I was looking closely at the lichens growing on a huge Douglas fir. Suddenly, I felt distinctly not alone. No biggie, lots of people use this trail, although not so many were out that day because the weather was so wet and cold. Then I heard it. A meow. That's odd. This isn't a good place for a cat to be out alone. We have lots of cougars and bears. Then I heard it again. Except it was weird sounding, almost like a robotic sound, like someone was playing a bad audio file of a cat. My gut started to clench. It sounded wrong somehow, and I couldn't figure out why. My hands were shaking when I unzipped my backpack to put my coffee thermos back in. I felt waves of nausea roll over me as the air suddenly felt strangely dense and thick. I was in a rainforest surrounded by trees and moss, but I felt like I couldn't get enough oxygen. I hadn't seen anyone for at least 10 miles, and I was distinctly aware of how far I was from anyone and how my phone didn't get reception here. Then I heard it again, louder and closer and even more wrong. But this was like no cat I've ever heard. It sounded like an imitation of a cat or a person saying meow. It was somehow also tiny, cold and robotic. Right, it was time to leave. As soon as I got out of the bog, I rode the rest of the way home like a bat out of hell, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. There was nothing there that I could see. I will never forget this experience for as long as I live. I've had some pretty disturbing things happen on my night forest rides, but nothing has ever spooked me like that strange and wrong meowing in the middle of the afternoon. I live in a downtown area of a relatively small city. A couple blocks from my house, there is a lake with a 5-mile trail around it. In the daytime, it is absolutely beautiful and a very popular attraction, but it tends to be sketchy at night because it's located in a lesser part of town with a much higher homeless and gang population. After dark, some questionable people can appear, and mixed with the eeriness of the lake itself is pretty scary. I've had some pretty strange encounters there, but nothing terrified me as much as this one. This happened about a year ago. The sun was starting to set, and I was questioning whether I should run or not. I should have known not to run if I was questioning it. So I decided I'd do, and set off on my run. I quickly learn that it is getting dark fast. 1.5 miles in, it's pitch black, only with the occasional streetlight giving me something. Around 2 miles I look ahead, and see a guy just standing in the middle of the path. As I get closer, this dude just whips it out and starts peeing in the middle of the path, like blatantly. I slow my pace down to assess the situation. Now keep in mind I'm 19, 6 foot, 180 pounds of pure muscle, so I'm not easily intimidated. But this was giving me a very uneasy feeling. I run around the dude on the complete opposite side of the road, and he's just staring at me the whole time. I'm getting freaked out at this point, so I pick up my pace a little bit and out of my comfort zone. It was too late to turn back since I'm already 2 miles out. Up ahead I begin to see another guy standing there. I have no idea of what's going on at this point, so I run around him as well. Another 1/2 mile up and there's another guy, and this time he's just staring at me. I'm completely freaked now, so I start sprinting my butt off. Another 1/2 mile from my house, and I hear this ear-piercing screaming behind me. It's like it's coming from 20 different people, but it keeps getting closer as I was sprinting. I book it, with all I've got to my house, and slam the door. I couldn't sleep for the next 2 nights. It could have just been some weird homeless guys drugged out, but it could have been much worse. Moral of the story: be aware of your surroundings, runners. especially at night. This happened a few years ago, while I was still in high school, and live feed cameras, door-ring cameras, were first becoming a thing. Must have been about 2014. I used to go running in the woods right by my house in upstate Washington. The trail began very steep, almost like a hike, and then became more flat and steady. That's where I would begin my runs. I would run every day roughly around the same time in the morning, roughly dawn, and the afternoon, before and after school. I was running before school one morning, and a tall man with a beard and a plain tan hat was sitting on the bench at the beginning of the trail. I hated dealing with people because I was an awkward teenager, so I began to look at the ground and just walk by him. As I got closer, I could tell that he was staring at me. I walked past him, and as I was going up the trail, I slightly turned around and saw that he stood up and was walking the trail behind me. Keep in mind the sun is barely coming up, so it's mostly still dark. Then I ran. This was not my normal jog, I was sprinting. No one was ever on this trail in the morning, and I'd never seen him before, and for some reason he creeped me out. I knew I could go through the forest, basically to my backyard, so I wasn't that worried, but I was afraid he was going to attack me or something. As I got further down the trail, I lost him, so I slowed down because frankly I was out of breath. Then I heard a man's voice say loudly, "Well, aren't you going to introduce yourself?" That's when I lost it. I called my mum and told her I thought someone was following me on the trail. I told her a brief version of what happened, and she instructed me that she could meet me with her car at the head of the trail just in case the man was following me. She didn't want him to know where we lived. I went down a side trail that cut short to the head of the trail and was looking out for the man the whole time. I jumped into my mum's car and started crying. I didn't remember why. I just remember being so afraid that I was going to be taken. The rest of my day went normally. I went to school, went to all my classes, and for the most part forgot about the ordeal. The rest of the week was normal, until Friday night on my way home from school. I stopped at the grocery store, and on the way out I swore I saw the man. I thought I was imagining it, so I walked to my car and drove home. I did not do much on weekends. I stayed home, chilled with my family, smoked with my friends, and that was about it. I was up late with my friend Josh, watching bad movie after bad movie, and then we started to hear a knocking on the window at around 3 a.m. I had some annoying middle school kids in my neighborhood who were always pulling pranks. So although it was creepy, being the macho kids we were, we ignored it and tried playing it off like we were ignoring the annoying middle schoolers. The knocking then transferred from the back room we were in to the windows by the front door. In the morning I told my parents and my dad checked the Ring camera. It was the man. There was a multitude of clips of him. First, a couple of him walking past the cameras as he was walking back and forth in front of the house to see if he could see inside. Then a few clips of him stepping back and looking up, as if he was trying to look into the upstairs window from afar. These clips ended at 1:45 in the morning. Then around 3 to 3:05 a.m., he showed up again and he was tapping the window, and we could see him in the camera. At one point he stood back and realized the camera and just stared at it. He did this a few times, and then at one point got really close to it and whispered something like, "How was your run?" He smiled and walked away. My dad called the police and had them come to our house. He showed them the camera footage, but since we didn't have cameras in our house or the back, we could not prove he was trespassing, and there's nothing illegal about talking to someone's doorbell. I never saw him again, and when the police checked back in the following month, they said they thought that once he saw the camera he freaked out and decided he was caught and to stop whatever he was planning to do. It was just totally horrifying. I was literally being stalked. I'm a guy, so something like this has never happened to me, and thankfully hasn't happened since. Safe to say, after these events, I got a gym membership. This happened quite recently. Today, we planned on going on a 4-mile hike. The trail makes a big loop, with the beginning point also acting as the ending point. The story begins in the trail parking lot. There were about 5 other cars in the lot, and out of the car nearest us came a middle-aged couple. We paid them no mind, as we typically do with strangers, and we headed off to the restroom before hitting the trail. They set off on their own hike. When we started to hike, we chose route number 1, doing the loop counterclockwise. The trail itself makes a huge loop, about 4 miles in length, with the parking lot being at the highest elevation, and the lowest point being the middle of the trail. The ascent from the bottom middle section to the top going in either direction is extremely steep, slow, slippery, and tough. About 20 minutes into our overall 3-hour hike, we reached point A, where we caught up with the older couple. About the time we caught up to them in the canyon, they decided to turn back towards the parking lot, passing us along the way. We exchanged smiles and waved as we passed, and again thought nothing of it. From point A to point B, everything seemed totally normal. We were hot and tired, of course, but were enjoying ourselves and thought very little about the other couple. When we reached point B, about 2/3 of the way through the loop, just starting the uphill climb back towards the parking lot. However, things started to get a little weird. As soon as we exited the low-lying canyon region, we saw the same couple heading towards us, as if they had returned to the parking lot and opted instead for route 2. We still didn't find this completely out of the ordinary, as the first canyon around point A was tough to get down, and it seemed that they were somewhat unprepared. The woman was wearing a knee-length skirt, which is a bad choice for slippery canyon slopes and climbing steep rocky bluffs, and it appeared they had not brought a pack with water or anything. We passed them again, exchanged pleasantries and continued on. This time though, we did talk briefly about the situation. We found it odd that they made it far enough to meet us at this point, as the first parts of routes 1 and 2 were steep and slow, and the area between point A and B was pretty flat and steady. Considering the difference in terrain and their age/apparent physical conditions, we agreed it was awfully strange to see them at that point on the trail, but we continued anyway, just shrugging it off and thinking nothing more about it. Soon afterwards, we made our way to the outlook, which was a few hundred feet above the bottom section of the trail, and 10 minutes past point B. As we paused to take some pictures and catch our breath, my wife pointed out that she could hear their voices down below in the canyon as we rested. We listened, and mutually agreed that it was probably the same couple, since the point the voices seemed to come from would be about the right spot for them, given the last location we saw them at, and the lack of anyone else on the trail so far. Still nothing too strange yet. That is until we reached point C. Between the outlook and point C, which was 20 minutes from the end of the loop and 40 minutes past point B, was a wide gravel trail with steep drop-offs on either side. You could say it was a sort of ridge, as everything within the loop made a giant lopsided bowl, much like a volcano, with the elevation difference between the lowest point of the trail and the highest point of the trail being about 500 feet. This made the terrain around the trail seem pretty much impassable. It was extremely steep and covered in thick undergrowth and fallen trees. It seemed to be pretty much a given that the established trail is the only way to get from the outlook back to the parking lot. As we neared point C, we were becoming increasingly exhausted and ready to be done. We stopped once or twice for about 30 seconds apiece to catch our breath, and as we got closer and closer to point C, it was as if the energy was sucked out of both of us. Of course, the trail was tough, but we had done it, and many like it before, and it wasn't even 80 degrees outside. Even as our mental focus began to waver, and we started noticing a significant change in our demeanor and attitude, we still marched on, knowing the end of the trail was near. When we reached point C, everything changed for the worse. Now keep in mind we saw the older couple about 14 minutes earlier past point B, and there was no way to reach point C from there except the trail that we were currently on. There were no shortcuts, there was no realistic way to pass us without us knowing, and no way to possibly beat us there. And yet there they were, sitting on a bench on the side of the trail eating lunch. As we passed them, the man mentioned something about a picnic to us and smiled, laughing. We tried our best, responding kind, but the mood was as if we had just walked into a giant black cloud of smoke. I'm not really sure how to explain it, but the area around them disoriented us completely, and we were no doubt as pale as ghosts and obviously shaken. It wasn't a malevolent feeling, and they didn't seem aggressive or strange, but our brains were just shocked into a state of horror in seeing them there. It just wasn't possible. We passed on by them, and as soon as we were out of earshot, my wife turned to me with a face I had never seen before in my life. We were terrified. Without saying a word to each other, we both experienced the same feeling of shock. It felt as if we had just walked through a time warp, or brushed against another dimension. Our following discussion amounted to this, that there was no way they could have beaten us there. Sure, maybe, possibly, just maybe there was a chance, but only if after seeing us at point B they sprinted through the woods in a direct line towards point C. Now this would require them to run up steep rock bluffs, through unmarked woods, and who knows whatever else for over a mile. In 40 minutes. That's how long it took us to get there, going at a pretty good speed, clearing our usual trail, which, as crows fly, was not that much longer than a direct route between B and C. We were in our early 20s and in decent shape, and we were dead tired by the time we saw them. And based on their apparent level of preparedness and fitness, there's no way, even if they did take a direct off-trail route, they could have made it there before us. On top of that, they had somehow found 2 Bud Lights and a lunchbox full of sandwiches on the way, and were almost already done eating them by the time we met them at point C. All of these things combined with the overwhelming feeling we got when we encountered them at point C have left us in mental shambles for the past few hours. We have no idea what to make of this, and no clue how to explain it in a way that even begins to make sense. So, weird hikers, I hope not to encounter you again. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was in high school. After school, me and 2 friends decided to go to our local bayou and explore the nearby woods. It's not the first time I had ventured into these woods. I actually grew up riding my dirt bike in them. But as we were walking through, we saw a very old-looking entrance to a path in the woods. It was an arch made up of dozens upon dozens of sticks and twigs, and us being young, we decided it would be a good idea to get on our hands and knees and crawl through this sketchy structure. Obviously not the right decision. It could have been a booby trap or something. Luckily it wasn't, and we continued on our adventure into the depths of the forest. After following this path for a short amount of time, we stumbled upon a tent and a wooden structure next to it that created a roof of sorts. We called out to the tent and asked if anyone was there, before deciding that it must be vacant. Since we're troublemakers, I think it's pretty obvious that we raided it next. Tucked in the roof of that wooded structure were machetes, pellet guns, and on the ground trash bags filled with a bunch of random containers and stuff which struck me as sort of strange. It seemed as if someone actually lived there. Inside the tent laid a mattress, and right next to it was a giant bong, and since I was a stoner at the time, I called out dibs as fast as I could. My friend sighed and told me I could keep it. Luckily, the retail value of the thing was about $250, but unfortunately, someone ended up stealing it from me not long after I originally obtained it. There was also some Jack Daniels, some blueberry vodka, which I snatched up too, so I ended with most of it for myself. It was starting to get dark. At the opposite end of this clearing was a trail that was covered in little tea light candles still lit. There must have been hundreds of these things. The trail wasn't very long and ended up leading back to the tent. So it just kind of looped around. But still, you have to be very meticulous to take hundreds of tea lights and lay them out on both sides of the path that was a couple of dozen feet long, and then light them one by one. After that, we decided to get the hell out of there, before some homeless guy came back to find out we snuck through their camp and stole some stuff. Looking back, I think we might have actually stumbled on a makeshift lab. Why else would there be a few trash bags lying around, filled with all sorts of various canisters and containers? I really think whoever lived there was cooking up some shake. I could be wrong though, but all I know is that place was sketchy. I ended up going back a few times even by myself, and it looked like the area had since been abandoned, with the tent and mattress being burnt to the ground. That area looked different in the dark, especially when I was alone. It had an eerie feeling to it, but that's not all. The candles were still lit. Panic spread throughout me, and I ran the hell out of there, never to return again. I spent the majority of my life in Pennsylvania, so a majority of my hikes have been in the Pennsylvania wilderness. In northeastern Pennsylvania, around the Appalachian Trail, the homeless people congregate and form communities. This isn't creepy, as it gets cold up there. I'm sure it takes a community working together to get through the winters outside. While hiking, it's not unusual to stumble across a community. The creepy part? It is known on the trail that they protect their camps with extreme violence, that if you find one, not to disturb anything. These communities can be pretty big, with 20 to 30 makeshift tents and shelters set up in the middle of the woods. When you accidentally wander across one of their camps, they are always empty, but the fires are still going and food is still cooking. So you know there is a bunch of people straight up watching you that are hiding. I always tried to make sure that I wasn't intentionally looking at any of their tents or belongings, and made sure to make my way out of there as fast as possible. Never once have I seen one of them, so it really makes you feel not that safe. Anytime I wandered into a camp, I made a mental note to never hike that area again, unless in a group. This happened quite recently. My brother and I went for a hike to stave off cabin fever from self-isolating. We chose a pretty remote trail to lower the risk of coming into contact with other people. I was walking ahead of my brother, and the gravel on the tracks was making our footsteps sound really loud. Deep in my thoughts, I was listening to the rhythm of his footsteps behind me. About 20 minutes in, I started hearing other footsteps starting off, faint, and getting louder, until they were the same pitch as his, but they were much faster, like a running rhythm. They suddenly came to a halt, and I could hear the motion of someone stopping on gravel. That sudden sharp and rocky sound, if you can imagine it. I assumed there must have been someone running/jogging on the track, and sure enough I saw a shadow to the side of me appear, which looked like a person's head next to mine, as though they were right behind me. I stopped and turned around to let them pass because the track was narrow. However, when I turned, it was just my brother staring back at me. He was confused as to why I'd stopped, so I asked if he was running a second ago and he said no. I asked if there had been anyone behind him, and he said that he wasn't aware of anyone. I thought it was strange, but just let it go and carried on. About 5 minutes later, we came around a corner, and there was this smell of just pure death, like a really strong off-meat smell. We figured it was a dead animal and kept going. We reached the hike lookout after 20 minutes, chilled for a bit and then headed back. We passed the death smell, and then around the exact same spot where it had happened before, I started hearing the running sound again. I ignored it this time, because it was starting to freak me out, and just picked up the pace to get back to the car. I told my mum, and she joked that the death smell must have been a dead jogger, and I was being haunted by them, to which I laughed. But now I'm wondering, what if it was? Should I have gone and investigated the smell? I was out walking my dogs in some woods right next to Foxwarren Park in Cobham, England. It's a massive Victorian manor where one of the owners passed away. The walk was normal until I walked into a field that I assumed was privately owned, and I saw an upturned horse box. I don't know why, but it's very unsettling for me, and I started feeling a bit sick and got goosebumps and a strange tingling sensation on my skin. When we left the field and went back into the woods, I still had this strange feeling and felt like we were being watched. On the route back to the car, we walked past a Victorian tower, and I think that was one of the outbuildings from the manor house, but it is now abandoned. The windows are still in, but covered in moss. I could have sworn I saw a humanoid entity with dark hair covering its face in the window. It could be me being paranoid, but I'm convinced that my previous experience has made me sensitive to paranormal activity. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't nice. My ex-boyfriend and I did a rainforest walk which drops deep down to the bottom of the forest. No other cars in the car park, and I didn't come across any other hikers. We had it all to ourselves and had a great time for the most part. As we were walking up, my ex was ahead of me, and they suddenly stopped, raising his hand up to signal for me to stop with him. I looked up, and there was this woman standing up ahead of us staring. She appeared normal, but I got a chill as soon as I looked at her. She had dark brown hair, which I only noticed because it contrasted so strongly against her cardigan. The cardigan was all I could focus on. It went right down to her feet and was bleach white, totally clean, as if it had just been brought off the rack. I thought about how ridiculous it was to wear this thing while hiking. We stood there totally motionless, just staring back at her for 30 to 40 seconds. We didn't immediately feel threatened, but there was no way I was going to take a step forward towards her. Instead, I felt this kind of weird stillness, as if the forest around us froze and time went silent. She finally turned around and began to walk away up the trail. We watched her and waited, not saying another word, until she was out of sight before we began to walk. The car park was around a half hour away, and we walked in silence, both a bit on edge and trying to listen for any suspicious sounds. We didn't see her or anyone else for the rest of the trail. Still no cars in the car park when we returned. It was absolutely the strangest experience I've ever had outdoors. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so very much for listening. I hope that everyone is doing well during, for what most people must be around week 7, week 8 of quarantine, depending on when you started. Nearly 2 months. Blimey. As always, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my lovely patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you're interested in joining and becoming a patron for some cool rewards, feel free to check the link to sign up. I hope everyone's doing well. We're all fine. We're still potty training. It's hard. Not gonna lie, we've had a few accidents, but I think she's getting there, which is definitely good news. Not much else to speak about, really. Trying to play some more video games in my very rare free time. Bought this console off a GameCube console and off the internet, and it arrived and it was broken. It just wouldn't read discs. It would try and read them and then it would just freeze, and that got really annoying. So I've now obtained another one, much to my delight. But of course, the process of returning it during quarantine is challenging, so I'm unsure whether I just should, deal with it and take the loss of the money. I'm not really sure. But it's annoying to say the least. Yeah, not much else really. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope you're finding ways to keep yourself busy. But yeah, I think for now it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.